Have you ever sensed that you have spent your entire life attempting to be noticed by someone who never truly saw you? This wound is more prevalent than you might imagine, but it is seldom acknowledged because, unlike mothers, fathers often fail quietly. He was present, yet his attention never truly settled on you. And growing up without that gaze means developing while constantly trying to validate your worth through accomplishments, through resilience, through silence. You learn to tolerate, but deep down, you are still awaiting that recognition. Carl Jung was among the first to demonstrate that a father's absence extends beyond your personal history. It affects something more profound in the psyche. The father symbolizes the axis of authority, the motivation to interact with the world, the wellspring of validation. When that figure fails through absence, abandonment, coldness, or unrelenting pressure, something inside the child breaks. It is not just love that is absent. It is the sense of self-worth. Today, I want to assist you in recognizing this emotional wound and provide you with a practical method to start healing it. From the earliest years, a child's psyche constructs inner images to comprehend the world. Carl Jung referred to these images as archetypes, primordial templates that influence our emotional experience even before we can speak. Among them, one of the most fundamental is the archetype of the father. At the symbolic level, the father is more than a man. He represents the psychic force that helps us separate from the emotional fusion with the mother and commence the journey of individuation, that is, becoming who we genuinely are. It is the energy that separates, that severs the invisible cord of emotional dependence, that positions a child before life with courage and direction. Where the mother is viewed as the source of love, nurture, and affection, the father represents strength, guidance, and protection. The mother nurtures the heart. The father prepares you for the world. And perhaps that is why the father wound is so much quieter and, at the same time, more devastating. Because while the mother's absence manifests as emotional hunger, the father's absence appears as a broken foundation, a lack of direction, a missing validation that silently erodes from within. When the archetype of the father manifests in a healthy manner through the real father, it provides a foundation of firm yet safe authority. It is the dad who guides without crushing, who corrects without shaming, who challenges without abandoning. He establishes direction, defines boundaries, teaches values, and most importantly, he sees you. He looks you in the eye and communicates, even without words, you matter. You belong. But when that archetype fails because the father was passive, violent, emotionally absent, or even idolized to an impossible degree, a fracture develops in the psyche. The child does not receive the push needed to confidently confront the world. Instead, they grow up insecure and divided, often trapped in a lifelong waiting room for an approval that never materialized. That absence cannot be filled with gifts, physical presence, or blind authority. It is emotional. And when that is missing, the father archetype becomes distorted. It becomes unreachable. And what should be a source of structure transforms into something that paralyzes. Carl Jung said that every person eventually needs to break from the image of the father, meaning to move beyond his internal influence to become whole. But when that father was never truly present to begin with, what breaks instead is the ability to trust. And what we end up seeking is not freedom, it is belonging. A belonging that, because it was not given, becomes something we pursue in every decision. This search for belonging, which commences in childhood, does not simply diminish with time. It alters its form, changes its setting, but remains active, operating in the background of adult life like an invisible engine. Most do not perceive it, but that profound exhaustion you feel, the ceaseless drive to prove yourself, the struggle to simply relax, often traces back to emotional roots established in the absence of a father who never affirmed your worth. The child who is not seen becomes the adult who attempts to be perfect, who seeks validation through titles, performance, and productivity, who transforms work into a battlefield just to demonstrate they deserve a place at the table. But no matter how much they achieve, it always feels like something is missing, like there is a debt that can never quite be settled. Carl Jung shows us that the father wound does not disappear with time. It embeds itself into the structure of the ego and becomes a lens, a filter that distorts how you perceive yourself and the world around you. The adult shaped by this absence often lives in a constant state of tension, as if love must be earned every single day, as if one mistake might bring back the disapproving gaze of a father who never truly saw them to begin with. That is the mechanism behind self-sabotage. It is not a personality flaw, but the echo of a wound. Deep down, there is a part that does not believe it deserves, that feels guilty for receiving, that cannot remain in success, love, or the spotlight. Because those moments trigger the same discomfort once associated with the father's gaze. demanding, impatient, critical, or worse, non-existent. Many carry that discomfort as if it is simply who they are. They say things like, "I am just anxious," "I hate being the center of attention," or "I cannot trust people." But these are not personality traits. They are emotional memories disguised as identities. They are defense mechanisms built to survive a kind of pain that still persists. The pain of growing up without a mirror to reflect a clear image of who you are. Without a father as external validation, the child attempts to build internal validation on their own. But without a model, without direction, that process is almost always incomplete. The result is an adult who functions well externally but is exhausted internally, who carries life on their shoulders but fears it could all collapse at any moment. That insecurity you carry is not weakness, it is survival. It is emotional intelligence that learned early on that affection was unstable and that worth had to be earned. But the same strategy that once kept you safe is now keeping you trapped. Recognizing that is the first step toward breaking the cycle. Not all wounds bleed in the same way. Some ache in silence, others scream in memories, but both leave marks. And when it comes to the father wound, it is crucial to understand that it can manifest in two very different but equally profound ways. There is the active wound, the kind you can clearly identify. The father who was openly aggressive, violent, or instilled fear instead of safety. Harsh criticism, humiliation, a total absence of affection, and constant comparisons. These are what many would call obvious traumas. They leave sharp, specific memories, words that echo, and silences that cut. The child grows up knowing something was not right, even if no one ever said it aloud. But then there is the subtle wound, just as painful. This one appears when the father was physically present and fulfilled his social role, but was emotionally distant. He provided, but did not listen. He set rules, but withheld affection. He was there, but his heart was always somewhere else. And it is in this kind of relationship that many children learn not to expect, not to ask, and not to feel. They adapt to the bare minimum, believing it is all they will ever receive. That subtlety is dangerous because it is confusing. The child cannot make sense of why they feel so distant from someone who technically did nothing wrong. And because there is no visible scar, they start to doubt their own pain. They grow up thinking that missing something invisible makes them ungrateful, that needing connection is a weakness, and so they shape an identity that does not acknowledge the wound, it just conceals it. Both forms, the active and the subtle, lead to the same outcome. A fractured sense of self, an identity built around absence, around unmet expectations, and around the constant need to morph in order to be accepted. Carl Jung reminded us that a child faced with a wounding or absent father does not blame the father. They blame themselves. They conclude in silence, "If he did not see me, maybe I am not worth seeing." And that thought eventually turns into chronic insecurity, a fear of speaking up, and shame about being fully seen. Because the father wound does not just whisper, "I lacked love," it screams, "I lacked recognition, and I learned to live without it." But living without being seen is exhausting, and eventually the psyche cannot keep pretending it does not hurt. When pain cannot be named, the psyche finds a way to survive. One of the most common paths is to deny the need entirely. The child learns that asking for love gets you nowhere. Showing vulnerability changes nothing, and seeking attention only ends in disappointment. So they start to give up, not on others, but on themselves. They stop expecting, stop expressing, and stop needing. They build a kind of independence that looks like strength from the outside, but inside it is self-abandonment. That child becomes the adult who never asks for help, who handles everything alone, who does not allow themselves to crack, who learned to endure but forgot how to receive. Autonomy becomes armor. Productivity becomes a hiding place. Emotional detachment becomes a shield against the pain of once being ignored. Carl Jung said, "The ego forms through adaptation, and when the environment demands denial, the ego survives by sacrificing vital parts." Emotion recedes. The body tightens. Spontaneity vanishes. All in the name of keeping the system running. But at what cost? Many adults who pride themselves on being strong, logical, or self-reliant are actually carrying a child inside who learned that feeling is dangerous, that showing pain means losing value, that needing love is too great a risk. So they construct flawless personas, versions of themselves that function in the world but are lost on the inside. And that disconnection takes a toll, because the more you deny what you feel, the further you drift from who you are. And the more disconnected you are, the harder it is to feel real. That is why, even in success, there can be a void. Even surrounded by people, there can be loneliness. Even in constant motion, there is a tiredness that never goes away. This loss of contact with your own center does not happen overnight. It is gradual. It starts when needs go unmet. It grows when silence becomes the norm. And it solidifies when someone believes that not feeling is a sign of strength, when it is really just another way of remaining unseen. Over time, that disconnection turns into a lifestyle. What began as a childhood defense becomes a full-blown personality. The person starts to believe they are naturally closed off, naturally in control, and naturally detached. But behind that armor still lives the same child who learned not to need and, because of that, still does not know how to receive. And society often rewards this adaptation. Extreme productivity, laser focus, and relentless self-sufficiency are traits that get praised, reinforcing the persona. Every time someone says, "How do you manage it all?" a small piece of that old pain retreats, but only for a moment. Carl Jung said that what remains unconscious becomes fate, and often the fate of these defenses is isolation. The person who controls everything, who does not allow mistakes, who avoids deep connections, does not do it out of coldness. They do it out of fear. Fear of opening up and being unheard again, fear of loving and not being loved back, fear of being seen and overlooked once more. Emotional distance, over-intellectualizing, and the need to control everything are all ways of avoiding the original pain. But in avoiding pain, we also avoid intimacy, vulnerability, and love. Eventually, what protected you becomes a prison. Life turns into a minefield where every emotion is a threat, where feeling too much is weakness, where needing someone is dangerous. "I do not need anyone" is often the most honest and most deceptive sentence someone can say. Honest because that is exactly what they learned, that needing others is too much. Deceptive because no one was born to live disconnected. And the deeper that belief takes root, the harder it is to break the cycle. Because the pain hides behind behaviors that seem normal, even admirable. But behind the success, the performance, and the efficiency, there is still someone who was never truly comforted. Someone who learned to handle it all, but deep down just wants to collapse into someone's arms without having to earn it first. When that unheld child grows up, they carry their defenses into every space, including relationships. What looks like choice or compatibility is often just repetition, an unconscious repetition of an emotional pattern that was never resolved. The father wound does not just shape how you see yourself, it shapes how you connect. It is common for those affected by this wound to choose partners who replicate the same emotional absence. They are drawn to people who are unavailable, emotionally distant, critical, or unpredictable. Not because they want pain, but because pain feels familiar. Carl Jung called this symbolic repetition compulsion. It is the pull to return to the original wound, hoping this time for a different ending. Hoping maybe now the love will come. Hoping maybe now the gaze will arrive. Hoping maybe now someone will say what the father never did. "You are enough." That is why so many relationships turn into validation loops instead of safe connections. They stop being about love and become about proving something. The person does not just want to be loved. They want to be recognized. They want the other person to fulfill the promise the father broke. But that desire comes with pressure, insecurity, and fear. And over time, it suffocates because no partner can carry the weight of healing a wound they did not cause. The more you expect others to give what you never got in childhood, the more disappointment grows, the more the pain repeats, and the more the relationship breaks down. What started as a search for love becomes a cycle of self-sabotage. Need turns into demand. Pain becomes control. Fear creates distance. And love, instead of being a bridge, becomes a test, a never-ending test of worth that no one ever passes. Recognizing this pattern is not something to feel guilty about. It is clarity. Because as long as you love from the wound, you will keep hoping someone else will fix something only you can heal. Loving with awareness means realizing, I am not that child anymore, and what I did not receive, I can now learn to give to myself before anyone else. Even after understanding the wound, reactions can still sneak in because some of that pain does not live in logic. It lives in the unconscious. And in the unconscious, time stands still. Carl Jung called it the father complex, a cluster of emotional patterns centered not around the actual father but around the psychic imprint he left. This complex acts like an emotional magnet. It gets triggered in certain situations and suddenly you are reacting like a child again, even if you are 30, 40, or 60 years old. It is that moment when someone challenges you and you shrink. You feel small, powerless, and ashamed, and you are not even sure why. or when a harmless critique sparks an outsized rage, or, on the flip side, a silence that leaves you frozen. These reactions are not about the present. They are echoes, emotional circuits wired long ago when you had no way to protect yourself. The father complex hijacks the adult self and replaces it with the wounded child, the one still chasing approval, still afraid of rejection, still hurting from authority or indifference. And the worst part, while it operates in the dark, you will keep reacting instead of choosing. It is like stepping into a scene where the script was written years ago and only realizing you are performing once the meltdown begins. A boss's tone, a partner's voice, a dominant male presence, any of these can be triggers. And then you blame yourself for not handling it better. But it is not about control. It is about an unconscious pattern still running the show. The key is to notice these moments with curiosity, not shame, because the complex does not need to be destroyed. It needs to be seen. And when you realize you are reacting to old pain in a new moment, something in you returns to the present. And with that comes choice. But the father wound does not just affect your outward reactions. Sometimes the harshest damage happens within, not in your father's words, but in the voice he left behind. That inner voice does not yell. It whispers, "You did not do enough. There is always something missing. Do not even try, you will mess it up. You do not deserve rest, joy, or recognition." It sounds like responsibility, like perfectionism, like high standards. But it is fear. Fear of failure, fear of not being worthy, fear of rejection. Again, Carl Jung described this as one of the cruelest effects of the shadow. When a powerful figure like a father wounds or fails you, the child's psyche cannot handle the idea that this authority figure was wrong. So to maintain emotional order, the child turns the failure inward. If he did not love me, something must be wrong with me. If he did not see me, maybe I am invisible. If he did not approve, I must not be good enough. This thought, repeated in silence for years, becomes belief. That belief becomes identity. You end up living under the weight of an inner tribunal where you are the defendant, the judge, and the executioner. Always owing, always not enough. And the cruelest part, that inner voice does not feel foreign. It feels like you, but it is not you. It is a psychic inheritance, a recording so old it is mistaken for truth. Healing that voice does not mean silencing it by force. It means slowly replacing it with something more real. A presence that can hold you without demanding perfection, that can guide without punishment, that can affirm without crushing. That presence does not come from the outside. It is born when you begin treating yourself with the respect you never received, when you stop being your own enemy and become the adult you always needed to find. For women, this critical inner voice sometimes takes on the shape of a wounded animus, the internalized masculine image Carl Jung said lives within every woman's psyche. It becomes a ruthless inner authority, demanding perfection, strength, competence, and control. It mirrors a father who was cold, demanding, or emotionally absent, or the idealized fantasy of one who never showed up. And when that happens, a woman distances herself from feeling, from intuition, from softness because she learns she had to be hard to be valued. For men, the father wound often hits the core of identity. The father was supposed to be the first mirror of healthy masculinity, a reference of balanced strength, grounded presence, and emotional courage. But when that mirror was cracked or missing, the result is often a man divided, confident on the outside but empty on the inside, forever afraid someone will see through the mask and find out he is not enough. Some people become hyper-competitive, obsessed with control, always needing to prove something. Others withdraw from life, avoid conflict, and shrink themselves, as if still waiting for permission to fully exist. In both cases, the authentic self gets buried under a mask, not shaped by the desire to be, but by the need to compensate. Carl Jung shows us that archetypes like the animus are not inherently problems. They are sources of power, but when they are wounded, they work against the psyche. Healing that wound means beginning to transform this internal authority into an ally. It means creating a masculine presence within that protects instead of punishes, affirms without dominating, and guides without crushing. Whether you are a man or a woman, this healing reorganizes the foundation of your identity. And with it, the world stops being something you have to defend against and becomes a place where you can actually live as yourself. When that inner structure is built on absence, life becomes a long attempt to make up for what was missing. Without even realizing it, a person enters into an endless pursuit, not for ordinary recognition, but for that one specific gaze they never received, the gaze of a father. That search seeps into every area of life, career choices, relationships, and lifestyle. Everything can become a quiet campaign to prove something, that you are capable, worthy, and respectable. It is like there is a stage set up in your mind and someone is sitting in the front row judging your performance, only that someone might not even be around anymore, or maybe they never truly were. And yet, their role is still active inside your psyche. Carl Jung said that as long as a complex remains unconscious, it runs your life from behind the scenes. And the need to be seen becomes the fuel behind every action, even the most self-destructive ones. This is how the burnout cycle begins. You never truly rest because everything you do carries the weight of trying to rewrite an old story. Even your victories lose flavor because they are not really celebrations. They are attempts to fill the hole left by an inner father who never said, "I am proud of you." And maybe the hardest part is realizing that no achievement can rewrite the past. No success can undo a childhood. No external validation can replace the love that never came. Trying to make that happen just keeps you chained to a time that is already gone, trying to reclaim something that never existed the way you needed it to. But there is a turning point, a moment when you can stop and say, "I do not need that approval anymore because I have grown. Because now I can look at myself and validate who I am." When that awareness is born, everything shifts. The world stops being a courtroom and becomes fertile ground, a space for expression, not judgment, for presence, not performance. Healing the father wound begins with a simple, powerful gesture, naming the pain. As long as it goes unacknowledged, it continues to operate in the background, shaping your relationships, your self-esteem, and your choices. And maybe until now you have tried to avoid touching that pain. But denial does not heal. It only prolongs. You have to say it honestly. It hurt. Something was missing and it still affects me. That recognition creates space for something most people try to avoid. Feeling the anger, the abandonment, the grief for everything that never arrived. Not as drama, but as liberation. Because what you do not feel, you repeat. But healing does not stop there. After naming and feeling comes the most important step, transformation. And transforming does not mean waiting for your father to change or expecting others to fill that void. It means stepping into the role of the adult who can care for themselves. Carl Jung said that one day we must become our own parents. That means building inside ourselves the presence that was missing, a presence that is firm and loving, one that guides without punishing. It begins when you start treating yourself with respect, when you say no to what hurts you, when you stop abandoning yourself. That inner father shows up in the smallest moments, in the way you talk to yourself, in the boundaries you set, in the conscious decision to stop chasing approval. This exercise is widely used by therapists, psychologists, and in family constellations work. Writing a letter to your father. It is the same process we use to heal the mother wound, but this time the letter is addressed to your dad. The exercise is simple. Write a letter to your father, but it is not meant to be nice or logical or polished. It is not a letter for him to read. It is a letter for you to release. Write everything you never got to say. The pain, the anger, the absence, the frustration, the longing, the resentment, the confusion, the silence. What you felt when he did not see you. What you wished he would have said and never did. The times you tried to please, to shrink yourself, to disappear just to be noticed. Do not worry about structure or clarity. Just let it out. If you need to curse, do it. If you need to cry, cry. If you get stuck, keep going. This letter is your safe space to truly listen to yourself, maybe for the first time. When you are done, read it out loud. If you can, look into your own eyes in the mirror as you read. Let the words move through you, not to relive the pain, but to finally release it. And then, thank him for what was possible, for what was not, but still brought you here, and burn the letter, for real. Turn that moment into a ritual. You are saying with that act, "I am done waiting. I am done carrying. I am letting go now. From my heart to yours, do it, but do it for real." I say this from experience because just like you, I had my wounds with my mom. They were subtle, hard to name at first. But with my dad, it ran deeper. An absence that looked invisible but cut right through me. For a long time, I kept going. I rationalized, I functioned, until the day I wrote my letter. I did not know what would come out. I started with no plan. But after the first line, everything poured out. Memories, unspoken words, scenes I thought I had forgotten. And with them came answers, connections I had never made. In that moment, I understood why I loved the way I did, why I was so hard on myself, why I could not rest without guilt. And it was right there that I began to change. That letter became a doorway of pain, but also of freedom. Besides the letter, there are other practices that can support your inner healing. One of them is therapeutic writing directed to your inner child. Picture yourself today standing in front of yourself as a child. What did they need to hear but never did? What would you have said to them if someone had just given you the words? Write it all down. And if you can, read it aloud. This begins to reshape how you see yourself from the inside out. Another powerful practice is the empty chair exercise. Sit across from an empty chair and imagine your father sitting there. Say what has been buried for years, speak your truth. If it feels right, respond as if you were him. Not to create a logical dialogue, but to let the emotion move through your body and out. There are deeper techniques like Carl Jung's active imagination. In these, you engage directly with parts of your psyche, the wounded child, the image of the father, the critical voice that has haunted you. These inner encounters can open some of the most honest paths inside you. Slowly, you begin treating yourself with more respect. You learn to say enough when it is needed, and you start to understand that caring for yourself is your responsibility and also an act of love. When that presence begins to settle inside you, something shifts, quietly but for good. The world, which once felt like a courtroom, starts to feel like a space where you can finally breathe. Life, which used to feel like a string of tests, becomes a journey of expression, and for the first time, you feel like you can simply exist without having to constantly prove you deserve to. That is what healing the father wound really is. It is stepping out of the battlefield. It is letting go of the defense mode. It is stopping the projection of your worth onto someone else's gaze. Because in the end, the father wound was not just about your dad. It was about how you learned to see yourself through him. And when that reflection changes, your entire inner landscape begins to shift. You realize you no longer have to keep running. You do not have to be the strongest, the smartest, or the most productive. You are not chasing an invisible trophy anymore or dodging a judgment that was never truly yours. You are finally stepping into who you are without the filter of pain. And that brings a kind of freedom that does not depend on applause, a peace that is not broken by mistakes, a strength that does not have to harden to survive. It is a strength that rises from within, that is born from reconnecting with your essence. After years of living in the shadow of what was missing, Carl Jung called this the return to the center, a movement that brings you back from the outskirts of a wounded ego and reconnects you with the self, the deepest and truest part of your being. It is not about becoming some ideal version of yourself. It is about shedding the version you built to survive and becoming honestly, imperfectly, wholly you. When that happens, love stops being a search and becomes an expression. You no longer love to fill a void. You love because there is something inside you that overflows, and that overflow is what finally reconciles you with life. Because where there was once a void, now there is presence. Where there was fear, now trust begins to take root. Maybe you have spent your whole life trying to be seen, trying to get it right, to please, to fit into a space that was never built for you. But maybe, just maybe, something is starting to shift. Because when you recognize the wound without guilt, without denial, it stops running the show from the shadows. And when you give yourself the care you spent a lifetime searching for in someone else's eyes, the cycle finally begins to break. What used to be a constant chase for validation can now become a quiet act of self-love. Not as a concept, but as a daily practice, as a real presence. You do not need to chase the love that never came anymore. You can stop, breathe, and choose from this moment forward how you want to relate to yourself, to others, and to life. This is not about forgetting what hurt. It is about giving that pain a new place, a place where it no longer writes your story, where you can look back with respect and look ahead with strength.